How can an urban planner get racial minorities involved in the planning conversation? Rethinking the planner's role in including the public interest of racial minority. Planners should always be striving to understand this community's public interest. Doing this itself is not a simple task. What are the interests of these immigrant communities? It is important to acknowledge that a clear answer does not exist. The public interest in the immigrant community also constantly changes through situation and period. The second generation members of these racial minorities obviously have different needs and culture from the first generation. A planner must acknowledge that making a one-dimensional understanding of these communities and their culture will always become far from the reality, thus should never standardize what they might know about the community. So a planner should be constantly observant, analyzing and trying to comprehend what these people's interests are. This raises the concept of the planner in the immigrant's position or being in their shoes. Scholars argue that planners should be aware of the epistemological differences between culture and delicately approach planning issues in these communities, hence adopt a culture-based planning. However, planners practicing culture-based planning itself is not a complete solution to the situation. No matter how much a planner, community organizer studies and attempt to understand the immigrant society, a complete inclusion of immigrant society must come from the roots, or in other words, bottom up. Even if the planner carefully practices culture-based planning, it fails to break from problematic top-down approaches of community administration. Even if an individual planner accomplishes a higher level epistemological understanding of a specific culture, that planner's capability cannot be guaranteed to transcend into the planning process. If the planner becomes replaced or retires, the planning authority loses its ability to communicate and understand these communities. This is not a stable system of racial minorities inclusion. The problem lies in the attitude that planners are to serve the immigrant community by treating them as an entity to be managed. This approach leads to a structural tendency for the immigrant community to be silent and passive, always waiting for the planner to provide. Thus, inclusion of immigrant communities should happen from these people themselves. More and more voice from racial minorities should voluntarily find its way into the planning conversations. This can happen only when more members of these immigrant communities find their way in the board memberships in the community. This is an approach to start viewing them as part of the community members who are eligible of joining community's decision-making process, such as community organizing boards and Chamber of Commerce. This should start from the change from regional authority themselves, preparing to accept and accommodate these people's voice by making them eligible candidates as board members or even directors of these organizations. It is easy to find community representing groups to be racially homogeneous, and conventional authorities spend professional governmental effort to allegedly serve the racial minority, but in reality we see few community representatives who are immigrants. This is a list of Champaign County's Chamber of Commerce, especially showing all the restaurants, food, beverages related businesses within the area. We clearly see none of the immigrant restaurants and businesses are enlisted here. This is also an issue of certain cultural groups unable to feel the value in community participating and raising their voices in order to communicate with the local authority. This lack of racial minorities planning participation can only be fixed when they gain trust that the community participation works and it is beneficial to the immigrant societies. Thus, a planner should find a way that immigrant business holders to feel welcome and beneficial to be part of the Chamber of Commerce of Champaign. So why is this important? Planners' effort to understand the interest of the racial minorities is a positive sign that the community is trying to reach out. However, an expert's effort is limited since understanding will always not be the first-hand expression of these communities' interests themselves. Creating a platform that lets the people speak for themselves is what truly includes the racial minorities in the planning conversation, and thus caring for the consistent improvement of participatory planning. A planner researching on a particular racial group on a particular manner is a single event, while forming a racially inclusive planning process is a structural change that will create a bottom-up solution.